Will you please join me in the call to the gospel? Silence on us, O God, any voice but your own. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed a strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" But when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Our text for the morning comes out of the middle of the gospel lesson. The 30th verse of the gospel according to St. Matthew is the 14th chapter. Peter, who is out there by his own wish, out on the surface of the sea, suddenly finds that he's not comfortable. In fact, he's beginning to sink. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." Oh, so human. At the beginning of the week, I finished a book, a very forgettable book. A book by an American author, and if I named him for you, you would know him. The book was indescribably dull, and the product, of course, of a very, very highly competitive literary need. Apparently, he has to produce 2 books a year. 2. And this was certainly not his best effort. In fact, I should have stopped reading at page 21, but I'm compulsive. The book was forgettable, but the dedication at the very, very beginning was not. The dedication was to a person I will never know, a female. And the context, exactly the same, I'll never know. But the dedication ran, "She gave us joy where there was none. And she brought us lyrics to a song that we had never sung." If there is an iota of poetry in your soul, I hope you were just stirred to capture what is attempted to be expressed to us. She gave us lyric to a song that we had never sung. And the criticality from me is that's exactly what happens in this place on a Sunday morning, or should. You should walk in here on a Sunday morning with an expectation that you're going to walk out different. And if you walk out the same, I'd take something out of the offering when it goes by. We owe you a new thought, a new idea, a new insight. Otherwise, this is just a holy habit that goes nowhere. When you listen to the Jesus story, and when you own it, when it becomes your story, there's a lyric to a song that you have never sung. Because it means that you're growing in grace. And that's exactly where the lesson this morning would put us. The anti-hero is Peter, but we all know Peter. Peter's original name was Simon, a very common name. And Jesus gives him this nickname, in Aramaic, Cephas, in Greek, Peter. And it means Rocky. Rocky, that's his nickname. And it's an intriguing nickname, I think, because rocks are not terribly attractive, are they? And they're not very smart. Dumb as a, well, you know how that goes. Rocks are the kinds of things that are impediments and obstructions very, very often. But the appeal of a rock is in its soundness and its stability and its solidity. Two insurance companies know that. Rocks have the quality of being firm and unmoving. And so, in a sense, it's a very odd name for Peter. Because as portrayed in the Gospel of Matthew, he's us, by the way. He is every person. He's omniperson. That's who Peter is. And when we read it, we have to say, uh-oh, the writer of Matthew knows Bob Bedingfield really well. Because Peter is this very odd character, isn't he? He goes from hero to villain, just like that. He denies Jesus at the very time that Jesus needed him. He doesn't think logically, he thinks sinuously. And he gets put off on the strangest things, mostly things that are absolutely unimportant. He's a straight man for stupidity. And he's often lacking in a social filter, like me. And so Peter then is in the very center of the story. Because you see, no matter what happens, with all of those things in his characteristics, all of those anomalies, he still has possibility, and he still has potential. He still can be first among equals, and that's who he becomes, first among equals. So, Matthew tells us this story. It's the dark of the night. It's been a long day. You know long days. It's been a long day. Jesus has been doing stuff. He's been teaching, he's been healing, and the energy just drains out of him. And he finally gets to the point where he's had enough. He's had it right up to here. People, just too many people. And so he goes and he says to the disciples, we're leaving. Now, in a sense, he has to leave politically because Herod Antipas, who is the king, has murdered John the Baptizer because John the Baptizer dared to challenge him on moral grounds. And apparently kings don't like that. So he's murdered John the Baptizer, but then this Jesus person comes along, and there's a great similarity, and Herod gets upset again, and Jesus knows he better watch his back. You do it once, it gets easier the second time, doesn't it? So, Jesus goes to the mountain to pray. He says to his disciples, get in the boat, get on the other side of the lake, go over where the Gentiles are. We're going to hide out for a while. So they go. And by and large, most of them were fishermen. They're out there in the lake, and the lake is broad, and the lake is deep, and the wind is against them. It's right on the bow. The wind is against them, and it gets dark, and the waves get high. And about midnight, fourth watch, about midnight, they look out, and there's this apparition coming at them. And at first they think it's a ghost. And because they're products of their own history, they get frightened. That's what we all do. When you try and determine the indeterminable, you go back in your history and you pull something out. Because everything has to have a reason, right? Even when it's unreasonable. So, they see this form coming, and finally they spot it, they make an identity, and it's Jesus. And Peter, impetuous Peter, says, Lord, I'd like to be out there with you. Bid me come. Jesus says, come. So, off goes the tunic, off go the sandals, over the gunnels, and he chugs out. Good pace, making good time for about 10 yards. At 10 yards, the waves begin to lap on the back of his knees, and the wind begins to push his head back, and there's that terrible human realization that he's in deep water. Starts up there, doesn't it, somewhere in the back of the medulla, and kind of runs right down the backbone. What am I doing here? And he begins to sink. He begins to sink. And the first thing he does as he begins to sink, he says, oh, you know the three words. Lord, save me. Not unknown to many human beings. Lord, save me. I have a new friend who was the former district attorney in the city of Raleigh, Wake County. 10 o'clock most mornings, if I wander into the library, the place where we live, he will share the Fayetteville Observer with me, which is, by the way, a really good paper. It's family-owned, has been family-owned since the Civil War. The War of the Northern Incursion, I understand. It reads exceedingly well, and when I sit down, he will give me the sports section and the funny papers, which I want. I will have to fight him a bit for the editorial page, which is a wonderful editorial page, right down the center in one of the goofiest states you can live in politically. And then, while I'm reading the obituaries to find out about my friends, he's reading the police blotter about his friends. And as he goes along, he will say over and over again, "Oh, so human." Oh, so human. And it is, isn't it? Oh, so human. The story that's being told us is a story. And one of the things you dare never do with a story is to literalize it. You take it seriously, but you don't literalize a story. Otherwise, you get caught up on the size of Jesus' shoes when he's walking on the water. I mean, that's not what the story's about. The story is written for the early church. The date of the writing of Matthew is, oh, come on, you people studied with me here, somewhere between 80 and 85. The temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed. Judaism has been dispersed to the winds. Until 70, the church, which was a sect of Judaism, kind of hid under the umbrella. It was safe. But now, there is no umbrella. There's no temple. There's no formal structure for Judaism. The church is out there as a furtive little group with wind and waves. And the message for the writer of the Gospel of Matthew is, where is your faith? Thinking about this message with you, for you this morning, I became convinced when I put pen to paper on Wednesday of a thought that I've never had before in all of these years. And that is that faith is an event which is totally and completely human. Religious people have it, but non-religious people have it. Because you can't operate in this world without faith, can you? You really can't. You'd never sit in the pew next to somebody if you didn't have some measure of connection. And I would contend that faith is the image of God shared with us. Remember the story in creation? God takes the dust of the earth, shapes it out, breathes into it the breath of life, leaves the context of the image of God in us, and then steps back and says, hey, not bad. That's because God's English. Not bad. So, I contend that faith, which is the means by which I get out of my skin and connect to you, is the mark of the divine. And you don't have to be religious to have it. You just have to be human. You just have to suck in oxygen, blow out carbon dioxide. You just have to be alive. Because the world really doesn't work without faith, does it? There are no connections. There are no ties. There are no relationships unless there is faith. Now, faith is a very, very difficult thing, and you need to know that. Faith is a work in progress. In fact, I think faith is really a verb, not a noun. I think it's an activity. I think it's an action. It's a thing that we're working on all the time, and sometimes we do it really well, and sometimes we do it really badly, and most of the time we're somewhere in between. Faith requires heavy lifting, because you see, faith at its very basis is a thing of trust. Trust is the single parent of faith. And trust is not a thing that comes easy for any of us. Trust is a thing that has to be worked and worked and worked all the time. And without it, there's very little, if anything. Driving down yesterday out of St. Augustine to here, I had NPR on because it's the one consistency coming down the road. It's only 2 points on either side of whatever you're listening to when it changes. The interview was with a former Secretary of State. And the interrogator said to her, is there a solution to the situation in Israel between Hamas and the Palestinians? Is there any solution at all to that atrocity on all sides, where there are no rules and proportionality has been lost, totally lost, where innocents are the victims, without either side even blushing? So, is there any solution, said he, and there was a long pause, which on the radio was a little difficult. And she said, no, not until they learn to trust each other. There it is. Not until they learn to trust each other. And you see, that's what goes on with us, with you and with me. Over the process of time, we meet and greet. We find some commonalities and we build a bridge. It is still very superficial. I'm not on the Christmas card list yet. And so we keep working. Who do we know? What's happened? We arrive in North Carolina, and the first thing we have to do is set up the bird feeders. So we go to Lowe's, and that's what everybody does, right? You go to Lowe's, you get the seed, you get the bird feeders. And so where we live, I talk funny. I really talk funny. And so the clerk says to me, where are you from? Where are you from? And I don't know where she means, last time or first time. And she means first time. So I say the Bronx in New York City. And she looks at me and she said, I knew it. I am told, though, that had I answered somewhere close by in North Carolina, there's another question. And that question is, who are your people? Who are your people? Now, that's a sermon for another day. But just think about that. Who are your people? Who are the people you trust? Who are the people that are family and kin? As crazy as families are, who are the people that are closest to you? That's an identity, isn't it? And that's exactly what we are talking about. Now, the intriguing thing is that trust works on a reciprocal. Go back to the Peter illustration. Peter's on the boat, and he says to Jesus, I'd like to be out there with you. And Jesus says, come. So Peter gets out of the boat because he trusts Jesus, right? Sure. Now, something happens to that, but at the same time, Jesus is trusting Peter that Peter is able to do what he wants to do. That's the thing about trust, you see. There are two pieces to it. When the trustee becomes the truster, that's how it works. Peter needed to trust Jesus, but Jesus already trusted Peter. Sunday after Sunday in this place, unless you've changed, and I don't think you have, you hear the important message that God loves you more than you possibly can imagine. But under that is something even more important. God trusts you more than you can imagine. God trusts you and me to be His presence in that world out there. But it comes hard. In the many years that I was with you, I would illustrate on occasion out of my own experience dealing with people who were special warfare operators. Marine Recon, I had first, second, and third Recon, and then Navy SEALs. And you probably remember that I told you that it takes 58 weeks to birth a Navy SEAL. It took 36 to birth us, but it takes 58 for a Navy SEAL. And even then, the attrition rate is 80%. And that's after they've gone through boot camp and OCS and Naval Academy or whatever. Now, they learn a lot of things. They learn all the warfare skills that they're required to have, and they will practice from that point on. But there are two things that become absolutely critical in the learning that are extremely difficult and therefore reinforced. The first is that when you get into an action, into a firefight, you don't run, you go forward. Totally counterintuitive. Totally counterintuitive. You go into the gunfire. The second thing is countercultural, and that is you're never going to make it unless you build relationships and connections. So when you go in the water, you have a swim buddy. And when you're out on a deployment, you have somebody watching your back all the time. Or you're watching somebody's back. And you build that so that that is a total and complete interaction of trust that can never be broken. If someone says he's a Navy SEAL and you want to check him out, there are two questions you ask. What was your class and what was your team? Because those are fused right there in their heads. What was your team? Your identity is in your team because it's the place where you can trust. The church that we attend now is not the Community Church of Vero Beach. On a Sunday morning, the congregation that I am in has maybe 80 members, 9 people in the choir, at least they sing in harmony. It's been there since 1799, and for the first 30 years of its life, the language spoken in that church was Celtic, Scots Presbyterians. There's a graveyard out behind the church. Last week, I taught the Daily Vacation Bible School for adults. They never had one of those, so we had 4 days in dealing with stuff. Before one class, I walked out into the graveyard, and the stones are there in relatively good shape. And those closest to the church, of course, are the oldest. One stone caught my fancy. The death was 1804, and then the name. And then there was the epitaph. The epitaph. He never made a promise that he didn't keep. He never made a promise that he didn't keep. I would like to have known him. Because he was a man that I could trust. You and I, as the people of God, live in the hollow of God's hand. His promise is very simple and very straightforward. I am yours, and you are mine. And regardless of what happens in this life, good or ill, you belong to me. That's God's trust for us. And trust always has a reciprocal, friends. And what God is asking in return is exactly the same thing. She gave us lyric to a song that we had never sung. And I contend this morning in this place, there's a lyric, and it's called Faith. And it's ours, yours and mine, to sing. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all, and the people say,